welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of The Breakpoint, I want to talk about 311 bases. Whereas last week I knew that there were only 3 200 bases, I wasn't sure exactly how many 311 bases there were, and I was shocked to find out that there were only 17 through goblins, and King Arthur doesn't have any either. I could have sworn that there were more, as this represents 10% of the total game. There are more 3-2-1 bases, which I think are less desirable, since 2-point spreads are the game's norm. 311 bases have a 2-point spread, but minimize the number of overall points that are given to the other players. Like 200 bases, their math is important, just in a different way. Building upon the idea that Smash Up is a 5-base game, requiring best of 3 to win, 311 bases change that math. Let's use our example from last week. Player 1 wins 2 4-2-1 bases for a score of 8-4. Player 2 wins the third base, another 4-2-1, to make it 10-8. If the next 2 bases are 311, and player 1 wins the fourth base at 3 and 1, the score is now 13-9. Second place on a 4-2-1 still gives you the best of 3 win and a final score of 15-13. But if the fifth base is actually a 3-1-1 base, player 1 still has the points advantage but can no longer win on second. They have to play for the win, and it gives player 2 a better chance, keeping the game engaging. Keeping the game engaging is important because a short game that ends too early is unfulfilling. It also puts more of an emphasis on the random draw, because less bases needed means fewer turns, less cards drawn, and therefore higher luck. To make the game as competitive as possible, the losing players should have a realistic chance to play their way back into it, and 311s represent a great way to do this. There's also something to be said about keeping the board fresh. I remember talking to players a long time ago, and they were saying that breaking bases feels great, like you accomplished something, and 311 bases naturally have a lower breakpoint on average. This means that you are circulating more bases and having more mini-games, since breaking a base is effectively its own mini-game, within the tapestry of the bases being the game at large. I also want to talk about the fact that the second place point can be take it or leave it. When there are 2 or more points out there, I will do absolutely everything I can to ensure I receive it. But if it's just 1 point, it may not be worth it to me. In 3-player, I routinely pass on the third point of a 4-2-1 if it doesn't seem worth it, especially if it allows me to maximize points elsewhere, especially on a solo. And I think that adds a lot of intrigue. At 2 points, I have too much to lose. At 0 points, I have nothing to lose. But 1 point? That's a decision I need to weigh carefully. You never want to be 1 point away from winning, but at the same time, it's very possible that point won't even matter to the final score. I certainly won't overcommit for 1 point, even if it means losing that point to a special. At least that special is out of the way. 311 bases allow for that type of interesting decision. So I don't mind 311 bases at all, but when I started looking at the specific 311 bases that we have, I realized that many of them are improperly incentivized. The higher the VP, the less incentive you need to play there, because high VP is its own incentive. Sometimes the relationship between bases and their VP spreads seems random and arbitrary, and it feels like the incentive to play because of abilities should scale against the VP. This doesn't always work in practice, but can still be a consideration. When I think of 311 bases with strong incentive, a few come to mind. Crystal Fortress can give me proper recursion, and if you have shuffling, you will appreciate its ability. I'm fine with making that my losing base because it has such a strong ability, and I'd have a desire to break it quickly to prevent someone from spamming it. The squared circle definitely has incentive, perhaps too much, as it can be really broken if you keep spamming the same random action. But the catch is that the naturally lower breakpoint makes it harder to keep spamming, since it will break quicker as you commit more and more minions, unless returning is involved, like spamming Invader and Abduction. But, as is often the case, the problem lies not necessarily with the recursion, but the recurred, as a card like Crop Circles is pretty insufferable when played just once. Still, these are things to think about, but there's no denying that the squared circle draws aggro as a result. Woodland Cottage stands out as one of my favorite 311 bases because it really opens up the bottom half of your deck. If you have unique minions, or even just high impact but lower power ones, Woodland Cottage can help you get them, and the base feels like you are trying to extract as much value before it's too late. One of my favorite Woodland Cottage moments was stealing it with a hidden Ninja Master on someone else's turn, only to grab a Shinobi with the ability, and then play the Shinobi for the final lead. The initial minion play was there because it's worth getting a 3, and then the opportunity arose to steal it. Other 311 bases are a lot more pedestrian, and while these issues would persist on bases with more VP, it makes it harder to justify going for the 311. Both monster bases stand out to me in this regard. Egg Chamber has a nice ability on paper, but it doesn't seem all that appealing, especially in context. It obviously has the greatest interest to giant ants, but power counters themselves make it harder to destroy them anyway. There isn't even that much destruction in Monster, with the vampires being terrible at destruction, where a simple power increase would do much of the same. Ironically, the best destruction faction is the one that doesn't have any power counters, werewolves. While you can argue that this is about open inclusion for all factions, destruction prevention alone doesn't do that much. A base like Hideout is much more interesting as a campsite. Castle Blood can be really frustrating because it's fledgling vampire, which is already difficult to pull off. The one power counter doesn't really seem worth it, unless you are breaking the base that turn, as it helps someone who is already winning win more efficiently their next turn. An island chain? Let's not even go there. Goblin Caves, as one of the newer bases, is an interesting choice for a 311 because it basically gives the goblins a VP. It has a chance to be 422, or 411, or 321, or even, in a crazy way, 312. Because the overall initial VP is capped low, the ability to go higher is nice. At 421, it would feel weird to allow it to be a 522, or to have two people randomly flip a coin and have one get it and not the other. As I said before, there are 17 311 bases, and the question is how many is the right number. One way to approach this question is to consider, if every base was 311, how many bases would be needed to get to 15? In two-player, trading back and forth, it would be 7 instead of 5. 12 points from winning, and 3 points from second. The score would be 15 to 13, with a lot of back and forth, and that would be fulfilling. Some players may think that this is too much, but the goal is to prevent 5 bases from being all that you need. Even if the math allows for a 6th base instead of 5, that's still a good thing, as it keeps the game from becoming anticlimactic. For every 532 base, and there are more of those than 311s, having the ability to tie it up without advancing too far is important. When you use the 532 example, 2 of those would be 10 to 6. The game is effectively 2/3 over after just 2 bases. I think that 311 and 532 should be roughly linear so that they have the ability to cancel each other out effectively. A 532 and a 311, outside of 3rd place, is the same as 2 421s, but as the quantity gets skewed to the right, the game feels shorter as a result, and in my opinion, shorter means anticlimactic too often. 311 bases change the math in subtle but significant ways, and appear less than a third as often as 421. That's a significant difference for just 1 point, but what do you think about them? Let me know in the comments. Next week, we'll take a look at what base distributions have not been used and whether I think we'll ever see them. There are some really interesting candidates to consider. I've got my list, but if you have a particular distribution you are curious about, be sure to ask in the comments and I'll cover that too if I can. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.